You know, you guys even know the story of like all the computers weren't going to change.
Yeah.
So that everything was going to, all society was going to crash.
Well, the new one I think I hear is like in 2012.
December
21st.
Yeah. It's supposed to be the end of the Mayan calendar. And supposedly it's been so accurate for so long that it just abruptly stops there. So that's the end of the world.
Well, kind of like December 31st in our calendar, though. It's supposed to just recycle.
Like lined up
Consumer buying, and they're trying to get people freaked out. But their calendar is in a cycle, just like our cycle, just like our calendar.
We're going to die of something horrible at some point for some reason.
Or as T.S. Eliot said, not with a bang, but a whimper. Actually, the more experience I get, the more likely that seems. But it's kind of a double-edged sword. I think it makes you less anxious about things that, in fact, probably aren't going to happen. But it also makes you less anxious about things that really might happen.
Right.
And making the distinctions between those is tricky. I mean, one of the things that, it's been a big political, I think mostly politically inspired belief for a long time, although, in fact, the economic projections are there, but also have always been there. I think for all of my gerontology professional life, anyway, not my adult life because I wasn't paying attention until I became a gerontologist. Social Security has been going to go bankrupt in 15 years from now, and Medicare is going to go bankrupt in about 5 to 7 years from now. And I've been a gerontologist now for like 30 years. So that it's always stayed the same distance into the future. There's been a little bit of variation, but it's, so, I mean, could it happen? I mean, certainly it's at least economically possible it could happen, but also, at some point. I mean, on the other hand, I'm sure I remember seeing projections when around 1980, that by now, 25–30% of the U.S. population would be over 65, and instead somehow it stayed about the same at 10 to 12%. I think some of that is, there's immigration and there's other issues that kind of played into it. We do these projections off into the future. We're just not very good at projecting the future. But it's also, one of the reasons why you want to have later born people, younger people coming into environments is the advantage of lack of experience is asking those questions. But why do you do it this way? Why aren't you concerned about this? And really being able to think through in a more precise, thoughtful way, hopefully, what we need to be worried about these things. 30 years from now, you'll either be looking back and saying, okay, we narrowly averted global warming as a disaster, and here's how we did it. We didn't avert it, and the world will be a lot hotter. And Las Vegas will have oceanfront property. All these things. Or, so, you know what? Grandpa was right. Didn't happen. For whatever series of reasons, people were wrong. And one of the most common things we do wrong projecting the future is that we're great believers in linear trends. And so we would say, like, what's happened for the last 5 years, plot that off into the future as a straight line. But lots of stuff doesn't happen that way. Lots of things develop quickly in the beginning and sort of look like a straight line and then they level out. I had a great conversation with the provost some years ago. Actually, we were talking about we were trying to make the case that gerontology has been growing and we're going to have so much more money in the future and some more things in the future. He said, well, but you're assuming that there's this linear projection, in the future. He said, if these kind of linear projections were true, the little convenience store over such and such door would now be supporting the entire campus. The first 3 years had this great growth in income. And if you projected that out 10 years, 15 years, they would have enough money to fund the entire USC budget. So, yeah. And anyway. So, life is complicated, you try to figure these things out. Any other questions about cohorts or enough about cohorts already? Yeah?
Is it defined in any way, or is it just sort of like a feeling of what a cohort is?
When you're doing research, it's defined in lots of different ways.
Yeah. That's how it sounds.
And so just like what's old and what's young old and stuff. You have to, so you can kind of keep an eye on it, and you can collect things that will have similar definitions. And you can see fairly similar trends in the things that have been well studied that we'll be talking about over the next few lectures. You can see similar trends on things where we've had replicable, consistent results. It may not be all based on like the same set of birth years, but if you go across the 20th century, the pattern is similar across different studies, or you can collapse different studies into a consistent pattern. So in that sense, there is a layer there. As you move into the popular media, I think it gets more expanded and more diverse and whatnot. And to some extent, like a lot of social and psychological constructs, there is an element of it can kind of be what you want it to be. Like you could be born in the same year with somebody else, and you might tend to identify in different directions, particularly if you're like close to the cusp of a cohort separation. So I've known people who would say that they have a brother or sister who's like a year or two different in age from them, and for various reasons in terms of who they hung out with in high school or college, one of them identifies with the immediately previous cohort, and the next one identifies with the next cohort. And so they actually can have a lot of separation, some of which is also motivated by sibling issues and so forth.
No, that's interesting because I'm at the, I was born in the early 60s, which is the tail end of the baby boom, but I identify with it because all my siblings were born in the late 40s and the 50s, and my brothers had draft numbers for Vietnam and stuff like that, so even though I'm a lot younger, I identify with that. And whereas, I know someone who was born the year after I was, and his sister was born in the late 50s, but that's a totally different thing, even though we're like a year apart, because he and his sister are close in age, and she didn't go through any of that stuff. He doesn't identify with that generation.
This does tend to be the stuff that cues you into your own aging and how you're moving along to, in the sense that I can remember this was already like a while ago too. But I remember sitting around at lunch with one of my research assistants when we were off at a hospital collecting data. And we were just having, like, what did you do last weekend kind of conversation, and she said, I got to see Born on the 4th of July with my boyfriend, and it's this Oliver Stone movie from his Vietnam series, and she said, and she goes on to say, I'm so glad I got to see that because we never got that far in my history class at school. And I just feel like the world opened up underneath me. Because in a way that you somehow, and this stays with you a little bit, I think, way far you kind of keep thinking yourself is not that much different from other adults until things happen that make you realize, okay, here's somebody who has no experience whatsoever of one of the defining historical events of my life. And on the one hand, it should be like perfectly obvious that that's going to happen, right? But, you guys will someday be sitting around talking to a younger colleague or student or something, and they'll talk about Obama in history books, or you'll say something about Obama or W, and they won't know what you're talking about. And these are the things that kind of move your life along. And you say, okay, so now I'm an earlier born cohort. There are people behind me that are in totally different worlds and totally different social historical contexts. And then eventually you realize they have different contexts. You're not that areas either. Or at least you're sort of a visitor. You can also, and I think I probably fairly frequently do make too much of this, but I think cross-cohort relationships share some of the same ups and downs as cross-cultural relationships. But there's a little bit